So good afternoon, evening, morning, night, whatever it happens to be in your neighborhood. Welcome to this, our fourth in our spotlight presentations, brought to you from the Biocommunications Association, or BCA. My name is James Hayden, and I'm Managing Director of the Imaging Shared Resource at the Wistar Institute in Philadelphia, as well as the current President of the Biocommunications Association, or BCA. For a little background on myself, I'm a registered biological photographer and fellow of the BCA. My entire career has been dedicated to various forms of scientific photography and imaging, starting as an electron microscopist at the University of Pennsylvania School of Veterinary Medicine, to a freelance biophotographer under the business name of Biographics, to my current role at Wistar, where we concentrate on basic cancer research, immunology, and vaccine development. My primary area of expertise lies in optical microscopy, photomacrography, and a bit about the topic at hand, which is digital imaging ethics. I received much of my training through BCA programs, and I would like to thank the association and all of its individual members for their guidance and insights over the years. Today, we're going to tackle an important topic in responsible conduct in research, the improper manipulation of scientific images. This is a bit of a follow-up on some roundtable discussions that we had at Biocom 2025 in Tucson this past May. But I also give this talk every year at Wistar and felt that it could resonate with members and followers of the BCA. Here lies our basic problem. These are the kinds of headlines hitting the news today. I made this slide a week ago with these current headlines. This is the kind of information that the general public is inundated with, and as scientific communicators, we're in a position to help counter this perception or make it worse through our actions and by our influence on those we work with in the scientific community. This is not just about how it might affect us as photographers, illustrators, animators, or videographers. More importantly, it's about how headlines like these erode trust in all of the work that we do in science and how that impacts the larger perceptions and policies of the industry as a whole, and in its effect on important global issues like healthcare. This talk is part of a larger series of training modules that the NIH-sponsored researchers must all take, called Responsible Conduct in Research. It's aimed at early career researchers, and I would like you to listen to these lessons from that point of view. This alternate title for the talk, How to Ruin Your Scientific Career with Bad Photography, is a way to stress that perspective to people just starting out. The standard RCR training modules are all accessed online, but at Wistar, we provide this specific lecture and a few others to all undergrads, grad students, postdocs, and others that are considered trainees. I believe that the only way to counter poor scientific method is through education, and few people consider the effects of improper imaging techniques on scientific results. In an era when everyone has a camera in their pocket, they don't often think about how it works, just that it gives them what they want. And they bring that same attitude to the microscope or similar instruments. I'm going to start with a little shock treatment. And yes, this scrolling is meant to make you feel a little uncomfortable. I want you to imagine that you worked on this paper that was published in Cell. As it scrolls through the entire paper, imagine how much time was spent on every part of this, all of the individual images, all of the illustrations, the photographs, the micrographs, the gels and blots, all of the graphs, the analysis, gathering together and documenting all the materials used, writing up all the materials and methods, putting together the references, all of the writing and rewriting and discussion about what it all means, then getting it together to submit and having to redo whole sections and rewrite when it gets sent back for revisions. Then adding more material to the supplemental figures, and then having to retract it all because you were caught cheating. This was the case with this paper by Dr. Gian Stefano Brigidi, originally published in 2019, but retracted 5 years later. And it's not just about the retraction. Are you familiar with ORI, the Office of Research Integrity? It's a branch of the U.S. Health and Human Services and is tasked with investigating serious claims of scientific fraud using government money. Every time I give this talk, I go to the ORI website and check on recent case histories to see what's been going on. That's where I first found this one. I don't expect you to read all of this. I present it merely as an overwhelming assault on your eyes to see the big picture. In the case of this researcher, after the investigation was over, you can see part of the list over to the right of all the figures that were deemed manipulated. The result of all of this is 5 years of supervision with quarterly reviews and half-yearly support reports to the ORI, additional work and scrutiny for any researcher that puts this person on a future paper, 5 years where they can't be on any peer review, which, by the way, is an important part of professional growth in science, and of course, retracting the paper in question. I always hope that there won't be more and worse than what I find, but I do rarely find that. I checked the ORI site in 2022 and found this one, which is very interesting for the people that we're aiming at, the undergrads and the postgrads. This trail started back in 2014 with Dr. Brand here. The trail started in 2014 as a graduate student, and they were looking at her PhD thesis. And the report goes on with 24 figures in one grant application alone. But 7 papers, her thesis, all of this was looked at. So have you ever heard of this place called PubPeer? PubPeer is the home of internet sleuths. It's a public-facing website where anyone can report and post examples of issues that they find in the published record. In this particular paper, there were many problems that were pointed out, but I find most interesting here is that the panels most often cited were images with negative results. Here you can see the fields that were felt to be duplicated. The greens are the same, as are the reds and the yellows. This is an important point that is often overlooked. You may think you can pop any old negative image into a paper, but that's not true. You must remember that a negative result is a result and should be reported the same way as a positive result, including its own visual proof. The image is negative because you took an image of something negative, and that showed that it was negative. Taking a negative area from someplace else is not the same thing. What we see here is considered duplication. So Dr. Brand got off easy. Only 4 years of supervision, quarterly reports and reviews and semi-annual reports back to ORI. Additional security or scrutiny of future grant applications, a couple of retractions, and she doesn't have to waste time on any additional committees for a while. But how easy is her scientific career going to be now? And then this last one was pointed out to me a few years ago. It was reported in July of 23. It was listed in Retraction Watch, which is another online watchdog site, and written up in the Philadelphia Inquirer. This was a UPenn professor, so it was pretty close to me. I first noticed 7 years of debarment, which is a lot, and I wondered what they had done to deserve that much time. Looking closer, you can see that there were 51 fabricated figures, and not just in one paper. In 5 papers, 1 unpublished manuscript, 1 review article, 3 posters, 3 grant applications, and 4 NIH progress reports. Well, as you can see in these previous slides, the ORI, as a government watchdog looking out for government money, has the legal right to enforce what they call these administrative actions. Some of the worst actions include ineligibility to apply to grants or having to return funds already given out. Not being allowed to participate in study sections or peer reviews can be a huge hit to your career advancement. Forced retractions or corrections are part of this. Constant oversight, including additional documentation to the ORI and whatever your institution also requires. And then how long the actions last, depend on the overall severity of the offenses, and take into account things like the pattern of abuse and the number of times it has been documented. If there is an effect on clinical outcomes, it also counts more. The absolute worst is being barred from these things for life. It has happened. So, do I have your attention? Good. I have a rather limited amount of time today to make my point, but it really isn't all that difficult. It's really just a matter of understanding what digital images actually are and being aware of any potential problems. In this unfortunate age of fake news, questions about our images can translate into doubts about our science. So, what exactly are scientific images? In the days of science past, in the age of analog film, images were mostly used for documentation purposes. The image was a reflection of an experiment, not the experiment itself. There were still best practices to follow, but it took time and a bit of skill if you wanted to pull the wool over someone's eyes using pictures. Today, however, things have changed. With the advent of digital technology, the images can now be the experiment. For instance, if you're measuring a difference in brightness between two fluorescent cells and inferring an experimental result based on those measurements, that means the images have to be treated just like any other experiment. It's not enough just to show a picture anymore. Now you are asked to quantify it and to think about every way you may possibly bias the results or otherwise invalidate your conclusions. A digital image is actually made from a whole lot of small little sensors that quantify some level of light and give it a numerical value. Of course, we call these things pixels. Every pixel is translated into these numbers, and when you put them all together, they create a pattern, and that pattern we call an image. As an example, notice this small collection of four numbers in the spreadsheet that display the specific values for the highlight in the eagle's eye. Information about how that image was acquired is also included with every set of numbers, and that's called metadata. It's part of every original file when it's created. So when we talk about an image, we're talking about the sum information from all of these pixels and metadata combined. Now, what happens if you do something simple, like adjust the contrast in your image using Photoshop or doing it on your phone? Let's take a look at a few pixels to get the answer to that. The numbers over the squares are measurements of the 8-bit intensity in each box below it. Knowing that adjusting contrast means making the lighter pixels lighter and the darker pixels darker is the first step in understanding what happens. The darkest pixels change from a value of 64 to 35, and the lightest pixels change from 242 to 250, while the midtones change by different amounts. Seeing that changing the contrast changed the numerical values for each pixel, you realize that by adjusting the image even a little bit, you change the information those pixels represented. So you changed the data and you manipulated the results. So all of this is really about understanding one very major thing. If you remember nothing else from this talk, remember this: pixels equal data, and changing the pixels changes that data. So digital manipulation creates image manipulation, which results in data manipulation. There are some basic things to do whenever you take an image that will be used in research. Most importantly, make sure to save your original data. Always save your files before doing anything to them and make sure that it's saved in the native format in which they were captured. The best rule of thumb is to first save your original as a file, save as, right? A file using that native format of the imaging device. In our core, that means .nd2 files for Nikon scopes or .lif files for the Leica scopes. The native file retains all kinds of additional information, that metadata we were talking about how that image was captured. You must be careful with digital files. If you ever hit the save button accidentally or on purpose, at any point in the process, you can overwrite the original file, and now your original is gone. Then, when you make any adjustments to your file and save as something else, it makes a copy instead. That's what we really want to do. And that's the file that you work with. So you save your original, and then you save it as a copy and work with that. Put the original away in case it is ever needed. Never save an original as a JPEG if you can avoid it. If you have to save it another way, then TIFF is best. But saving as a JPEG, you're using an algorithm that compresses the size of the image and throws out some of the information in the process. But you don't know which information. JPEGs also do not usually retain the metadata, so you can throw out the acquisition parameters as well. So, what are you going to do when someone from the Office of Research Integrity asks to see your original images to prove that you weren't doing something wrong in the figure you made for your paper? Go ahead and try to prove you followed all the rules when you don't have that original data to compare it against anymore. So let's ask the big question. Why are images manipulated in the first place? There are some good reasons, for example, to enhance details in an image to make it more clear, or to make the image look more like it looked to your eye, or to clean up obvious visible artifacts. All of these have a level of subjectivity to them that makes absolutes a bit messy, but these are generally the reasons that people give for cleaning up an image. Things cross a line, however, when you manipulate to make up for bad technique or to make up results because what you got wasn't what you expected. Image manipulation is consciously altering the visual record to present a different result. However, there are many ways that that can be achieved, and they're not all about adjusting the pixels. Things like the area that you select to photograph and the acquisition parameters that you choose to use. These can bias your results. And of course, the software manipulation is what we've already been talking about. Here's a quick example of biased selection. Here we have two representative images of pancreatic tumors, and you have to make a clinical diagnosis to stage them. Which of these would be a 3? Which would be a 4? Actually, they're both images from the same tumor. We got different visual results just by picking different areas to make our point. So technically, they're both accurate representations, but you're missing the bigger picture. This is one reason why you are asked to quantify images and average the results from a higher number of cells. Here's an example of incorrectly using the camera settings. The image on the left is my negative control, and the image on the right shows my positive cells, right? Well, only because I said so. In reality, they are images of the exact same spot on the slide. I just took the image on the right with 10 times more exposure. You really cannot compare two images that were taken with different settings or adjusted in different ways. I've seen this. If I adjust the brightness on the control image, you can see that it's the same image hiding underneath. So by now, you're probably wondering what is acceptable and what is not for publication purposes. Luckily for us, every journal has a guide for this. It's called the Instructions to Authors, and you can find it published by every journal on their website. In it, you'll find those things that are considered okay by the journal and those that are not. Some even give you helpful little blogs about common problems they see. Unfortunately, there is not a lot of consensus about just what is acceptable, but there are some general rules, and you'll just have to check out the specific journal instructions to get their requirements. So let's be nice and just ask, what is acceptable? Generally, global adjustments that are made to the entire image equally and do not mask any information are in the maybe this is okay category. Things like brightness and contrast, keeping in mind what I said earlier about contrast, as well as overall color balance are common things that can be okay, but even these general parameters aren't universal. Sometimes we call these darkroom adjustments. Interesting, Interestingly, just about any manipulation can be okay if you explain what you did in the text. You will see in many of the journals that nonlinear adjustments are often mentioned. Even though they are applied to an entire image, they are generally not acceptable without disclosure. The most common of these is gamma. Here you can see the original image on the left, the one adjusted for brightness and contrast in the middle, which might be considered acceptable, and the gamma adjusted one on the right that brings out details in the midtones differently than the highlights and the shadows. That is what makes it nonlinear and unacceptable. Even though the image looks more accurate, more like what you saw, you adjusted different parts of the image in different ways to match a subjective interpretation of what you saw. Other things that are unacceptable would include obvious things like copying and pasting regions within an image, or cloning, erasing, painting, or using things like the healing tools in Photoshop. Some filters, even like sharpening or despeckle, can also be overdone and land you in that bad category. Basically, the journal Science says selective enhancement or alteration is not acceptable. So, to sum it all up, what it really boils down to is this: image manipulation is unacceptable when it's used to misrepresent the scientific record, and nobody cares if you didn't mean it. When you alter the data by accident or on purpose, you are manipulating the truth. So, how is all of this decided? What makes one image good and another bad? Well, the short answer, unfortunately, is that it depends. But ORI has a pretty solid definition about research misconduct that, when applied to images, can give some guidance. They state this particular line here: research misconduct is defined as fabrication, falsification, or plagiarism in proposing, performing, or reviewing research, or in reporting research results. The two parts that apply most here would be this one, fabrication, which is just making up the result, and this one, falsification, which is basically defined as any purposeful misrepresentation of your data. I've shown you a few examples so far of each. The difference can often depend on the intent. Was it on purpose? Was it accidentally? Plagiarism doesn't really apply to our topic for today, and it is good to note, I suppose, that contrary to what I said in a previous slide, they will take into account honest mistakes to some degree. So way back in 2004, this paper by Rossner and Yamada came out in the Journal of Cell Biology, and it's still considered the seminal paper on the subject. I highly recommend that you read it, and I have the citation at the end of the talk. Here are a few examples that they provided. In the first, they're showing what an accomplished Photoshopper can do when they don't like the bands in their Western blots. Along the top in figure A, you can see that the band in the third lane has been removed. And in part B, you can see that they cloned in some bands along the bottom instead. Do I really have to tell you that that is lying? How about this one? This one's a little bit more subtle. Notice that as they increase the brightness and contrast in this gel, which we said was okay before, they go too far. And bands that are actually in the number one original on the left are lost by the time we get to the third one. No cloning or erasing was necessary, but the end result was the same. The authors also warn against presenting single lanes cut out of a gel, as that eliminates all frames of reference. The examples in their paper are mostly examples of falsification because the original images were manipulated and changed. Next, I want to show you this real example from a paper that was actually published and later retracted. The entire figure is on the right, taken directly from the PDF online. We're only going to look at three areas, the ones outlined in the dotted red. But there were 5 figures in the paper like this, all with similar issues, and there's a lot more in these figures that I'm not showing you. Let's take a look at this first one. Do you notice anything interesting about it? Well, how about those two? You can see that those two lanes were actually copied, flipped, and pasted to make the other two lanes. How about this one? In the figure on that right, you can see more of the same, only this time it includes two different gels in the figure. It's interesting to note that these problems stand out when you look at the small artifacts in the images, like that little bleb along the bottom in the left-hand one. That's what actually gives it away. And then I really like this one. If you look closely, maybe by now some of you have seen it, you can see that the four lanes there are the same as the four lanes there. And okay, you need four conditions for your cyclin D1. That's okay. Do it once and just mix and match the lanes as needed. All the red arrows represent a single lane copied many times. Same with the yellows, greens, and blues. What we're seeing are 18 published lanes from 6 original ones. These are probably examples of fabrication where an image was created from pieces of others and then claimed to be original. Here is an example of what not to do as well. I made up this image based on an actual paper that I was given to analyze. The original looked a lot like this one on the left. There was one overall set of cells, but you notice that some of them over on the right did not have any red in them, and that was critical to the point that they were making in the paper. Presented as you see it here, it made a compelling argument. When analyzed, though, you could kind of see how it was done. They actually used 3 original images that were composited together. 2 of them, notably, were taken with red, green, and blue channels, as they should, and one, the one with no red in it, was taken with only the green and the blue channel. Remember what I said about taking a picture of something negative to show it's negative? Well, they didn't give it the opportunity here. You can't show red if you don't try to take it in the first place. Some areas were also erased, other areas were painted in. In the paper, there was no indication that this was even a composite at all, which was also unacceptable for the journal that it was being presented to. So the lesson here is that even if you think you're being real clever and did a good job of it, there are easy ways to unmask and find the fraud. The paper I analyzed was obviously rejected. Here's one from 2018, a Nature paper on CAR T immunotherapy. Really hot topic, even more so today. In this figure along the bottom, when the blots were analyzed, they were found to be used multiple times, just like in that previous paper I showed you. The colored outlines show you which was which. But then there were other things as well. If you look carefully at the color images up top, right up there, you notice that the red one in the middle does not show the same pattern that you see in the merged one on the right. You can see that sort of Y thing in the green, but you don't see that hourglass shape of the red. Well, maybe that was an oversight on their part and someone dropped in the wrong red image when they made the figure. Maybe we can give them a break on that. But what about this one? Same paper, and here they used this image to represent 1 hour of HST cells, and the exact same image as 6 days of the NT condition. And if that's not enough, they did it again over here, right, where they represented 2 different time points. All right, now the situation has become extremely sloppy at a minimum, but given the overall pattern of abuse, this paper was also retracted. And of course, you don't want to be on the receiving end of these kind of headlines either. It starts with the top left where bad image prompts correction and ends 17 years later on the lower right with stem cell research shattered after fabrication scandal. And all of that includes retracting 31 papers and paying back $10 million in grant money. Imagine all of the work that was lost. This one came out just last year. The original paper linking amyloid plaques as the leading indicator of Alzheimer's disease was retracted. Since that paper came out, Over 2,500 other papers referenced it and based more research on those original findings. Drugs were developed for treatment, all of those based on those original ideas. But it turns out that images from that paper were manipulated, at least partially altering the results and what they meant for the disease. That's literally billions of dollars spent and hundreds of thousands of hours of research done based on flawed data or flawed images. This is one of those images, as shown and annotated in PubPeer. Gels and blots are commonly found to be manipulated in these kind of question papers. Note that there's a slight difference in contrast, making it difficult to see it at first, but once you get in there close and see it, you can't unsee it. And the problem is only getting worse. Here are a few headlines from the past couple of years, including the one about the resignation of the Stanford president that came out last year, as well as questions about the work of a Nobel Prize laureate from 2022. And even more from this last year, including a major controversy from the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. In the past, I used to say that the best way to uncover improperly manipulated files made in Photoshop was to use Photoshop. So now AI is being increasingly used to ferret out these problems, but that can create new problems of their own. When I first started giving this talk, I ended here. But we are at the beginning of a new revolution that has the potential to provide both great usefulness and great complication. Artificial intelligence is a buzzword that is quickly being seen just about everywhere. The most important thing to remember about this is that it's just a tool, like any other, that can be used correctly or incorrectly, and the best way to keep ahead of it is to understand just what exactly it can do. There are many ways that we use AI in our core right now, especially for analysis. But as this talk is about more nefarious issues, I want to point out some potential major problems that we will all have to address in the very near future. Generative AI basically means using a computer algorithm to create something new from multi-source data. We've all heard about ChatGPT, and maybe some of you have even tried using it. It works by taking a known set of information, either in the public domain like the web, or a limited data set that you provide, and creating a paper or report based on the information that it finds there. In the beginning, like any other child that is still learning, it got a lot of facts wrong, but it wrote about it in perfect authority. It will only get better because it's trained to learn from its mistakes. Have you heard about DALL-E? That's even worse. There's other programs like it as well, and they can generate images based on nothing more than a text prompt. Many of these kinds of programs create digital illustrations as well, but this one creates photorealistic images, pixel by pixel. In a recent example, National Geographic asked Frans Lanting, a famous wildlife photographer, to supply a collection of images like these cheetahs, all a bit different, but all of the same subject. The images were tagged as they usually do in the Nat Geo collections, and then DALL-E was let loose on it. Using nothing more than a text string, they asked the software to create, and I quote, a National Geographic style profile photograph of a cheetah in Africa, unquote. Maybe some of you have seen what I'm getting at already, but one of these two images is a real photograph, and one was created out of thin air from that text prompt. Can you guess which is which? I'll give you a minute to try to think about it. I will point out that every time I give this talk, it's usually about 50-50. Half of the audience thinks it's one, and the other half of the audience thinks it's the other. You figured it out yet? There you go. So this particular capability really worries me. Up till now, we've been dealing with unethical manipulation in images, but we've been able to catch it because it was just that, an original image that was then manipulated. The problem with that cheetah image and others like it are that they are not manipulated. They are original images made one pixel at a time. Nothing was changed from the original, so how can that be identified as a fake? So I don't expect anyone here to do this, but here's an example that I thought of how such a process could potentially be misused in reporting scientific information. What happens when a researcher hits a deadline and needs an immediate image for a figure, and they could just say, hey, give me a fluorescence photomicrograph of 3 prostate cancer cells labeled with blue nuclei, green actin filaments, and red mitochondria. They would get an image. It wouldn't have all the detail, but it would be a really close thing. Those details, however, make all the difference. In this quote, published in 23, Anderson Roca said in journal Nature, he said that he had not seen any synthetic images in papers yet, but only 1 year later, this happened. Maybe you've heard of this one. Our colleague Maya Diviak in Australia gave a talk in May of 24 and included these next few slides. I asked her if I could add them to this talk because they are rather eye-opening. It was published, this paper was published in February 13th in Frontiers in Cell and Developmental Biology and retracted 3 days later. You'll see why. Although it did not create photorealistic images, it used Midjourney to create illustrations. The text probably also used Gen AI tools as it contained unusual words such as delves and realm, at least that's what they say. Now, to be fair, the authors were upfront about this, which should have motivated both reviewers and the editor to look at the figures more closely, but they didn't. That's a separate problem. And here is what was actually published. Here we have figure 1, showing a rat, helpfully labeled, with 4 testes and a giant penis, also helpfully labeled as dyslist. Other interesting labels include cenctolic stem cells, dialoctal stem cells, testoma cells, and to the right, an interesting array of inserts, including something labeled DCK, and a petri dish of red and blue stem cells with a serving spoon. Continuing on, we have figure 2 and 3, apparently showing the JAK-STAT pathway, complete with unknown symbols, multiple unknown languages, and a central donut shedding sprinkles. Not really. Figure 3 is supposed to represent the regulation of spermatogonial stem cells by JAK-STAT pathway, but is more reminiscent of an alien pizza, again with nonsensical labels. And then, most recently, this Nature paper came out. This was less than a year ago, last November. This group in Germany was published this, November of 24. In it, they used AI to generate what appeared to be photomicrographs of a kidney glomerulus, and they asked a large group of over 800 participants, both experts and non-experts, to determine what was original and what was created artificially. Unfortunately, the title here pretty much tells you the results. So, can you guess which is the original? I'll give you a minute to look at it again. 1 is the original and 2 are not. Well, image B is the original photomicrograph, one of many that were used to train the software that then created the others. Now remember, the more you train, the more realistic they become. So image C over on the right was created with only 3 training images, while image A over on the left used 15. It's important to remember that over 30% of the 526 experts in this study got this wrong, including pathologists. So, how can you avoid all this? Well, simply by employing good scientific method and experimental design, including controls. Use good imaging technique. Understand your subject and how it is affected by all the steps involved in your experiment. When it comes to image analysis, my colleague Fred always likes to say garbage in, garbage out. Save your original files in a safe place and only work with copies. This way you can always go back to the original and start over. Plus, you have them in case anyone asks for them, and they will. Disclose all of your adjustments. Honestly, just about any manipulation can actually be considered acceptable In some circumstances, the problems happen when you don't tell anybody about how you got there. A viewer may not like how you adjusted a file, but they can't say you were trying to lie about it if you tell them what you did. And then, of course, follow all directions to the instructions to authors for the journal you're submitting to. They have their rules, follow them, or they will reject your paper and possibly report you to ORI if it's bad enough. And lastly, stay away from AI. Here are a few of the useful older references that you might also want to look into. That Rossner and Yamada paper up top, but they go back to the early days before AI, when we all still believed what we saw. I do have a few announcements. So first, for those of you who are BCA members, we will be having our town hall meeting, which was deferred from Biocom. This time we'll have it in October. Look for a link to be posted on the website soon. We're aiming for October 15th. If you're not a member, please consider joining the association. You can do so by hitting the big orange button on the website. Through membership, you can find a professional home with others that do this kind of work, hear more about topics like today, and add your own insight to help your peers. In November, we will have our next Spotlight presentation, this time highlighting some of the winning images from BioImages, our annual imaging competition. Again, look for more specifics to be posted about that. And speaking of BioImages, the portal will be open for submission during the month of February in 2026, with winners announced in a virtual presentation next May. So thank you for your attention.